In this activity, I challenged myself to visit Mungo National Park. Ever since seeing photographs 40 years ago of its moon-like landscape and hearing about the unique anthropological discoveries made along its vast Lunette, I'd wanted to go there. Mungo National Park lies in the far southwest of New South Wales and is an 800-kilometre drive from where I live in Canberra. I left at 4:30 a.m. on Wednesday 11th of June, and with 4 stops along the way, I arrived at Mungo Lodge some 10 hours later. Most rural roads in Australia are relatively easy driving, and in this part of the country they're mostly flat and straight. There's little traffic, and the road across the Hay Plain in particular has the speed limit of a freeway. However, the last 150 kilometres from Balranald into Mungo is a little more testing. While still tar for the first 100, the road becomes increasingly narrow until at one point it's a tight single lane. Then the last 50 kilometres of the road is dirt, and while on a sunny day it's a very easy drive, it is signposted as not being an all-weather road. With a red clay base, in the wet it would rapidly become a tough four-wheel drive challenge. I didn't see another car for the entire 150-kilometre drive, though I did come across a wagon pulled by 2 Clydesdale horses just after entering into Mungo National Park. There's 3 main facilities at Mungo: the National Park Visitor Centre and Ranger Accommodation, a campground, and Mungo Lodge, which is where I was staying. After checking into my accommodation, I first headed to a lookout over the lake, which, for reasons that I will explain in a moment, is dry and covered in saltbush. I then drove down to the visitor centre, which had some excellent displays. The following morning, I joined a 2-hour ranger-guided tour of the Mungo Lunette, which is the only way that visitors are allowed to walk outside any of the designated public areas.
As far as your eyes can see, you imagine 14 metres of fresh water. Then the lake's dried out, then Europeans arrive, introduce your sheep and goats, cut down trees. So all that sand that used to be down there is there. So you imagine metre a year, how much sand's actually moved from there to where it is today since Europeans arrived. Now if you weren't doing this tour, you don't see any of this. You don't see what you can see from that viewing platform.
Australia's continental crust is the oldest land on Earth, being formed some 4.4 billion years ago. Since this time, erosion has worn the landscape down to a relatively smooth surface. Nowhere is this more obvious than in Central Australia, which, during the Pleistocene epoch, contained many vast but shallow lakes, including the Willandra Lakes system and Mungo Lake. Fed by waters from Australia's east coast mountains, these lakes once held large quantities of water. However, following the last glacial period 20,000 years ago, cold and dry conditions prevailed and the lakes dried out completely. Wind erosion then played a significant part in the evolving geomorphology of the region. In the increasingly dry climate, vegetation cover was much reduced, which resulted in faster rainwater runoff, with regular floods carrying sand and gravel across the plains. As the lake waters evaporated, the wind pushed fine particles of sand, salt and clay from the lake bed into large crescent-shaped dunes called lunettes, which progressively buried whatever lay beneath them: plants, animal bones, human remains and artefacts, shells, middens and fireplaces, all placed within the sediments in a textbook sequence of passing years.
These are freshwater mussel shells from out of the lakes here behind us. So where we're standing, this is what's known as a mitten shell. Or today people call it a rubbish tip. So when the fish cook their mussel shells, fish bones, turtle shells, emu eggs, kangaroo bones, emu bones, etc., 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 instead of having this scattered all over the place, they would have these piled up in one area. So you find a lot of these mitten shells a lot closer to the riverbanks and also to the shorelines.
The Lunette on the eastern side of Lake Mungo, which stretches for over 30 kilometres and in places reaches heights of 30 metres, is composed of loosely cemented whitish sands and well-consolidated clays with 3 distinct sedimentary layers. Within these layers lie remains of highly significant archaeological and cultural importance because they reveal a long history of human and animal presence, and it is from this particular lunette that the Mungo Mystery emerged. But before we delve into that, we first need to know a little of the region's more recent history. European settlers first came to the Mungo region in the 1840s and over the next few decades took up vast pastoral holdings for their sheep and cattle operations. By 1870, 50,000 sheep a year were sheared in the Golgol Station shearing shed. However, overgrazing of the fragile vegetation, compounded by the invasion of rabbits in the early 1880s, changed the Mungo's region ecosystem detrimentally. Then drought struck in the late 1880s, bringing windstorms and widespread erosion to the desiccated landscape. The farm owners struggled through to the 1920s, when many of the large pastoral runs were divided into smaller soldier-settler blocks. But for them, tragically, the carrying capacity of the land had been dramatically and irreversibly reduced. Finally, in the 1960s, 2 completely different activities arrived. Firstly, tourism, with visitors enticed by the scenic wonders of the Mungo Lunette, and secondly, scientific research, with geologists enticed by its unique geomorphology. Over the next decade, as the viability of farming operations declined, recognition of the environmental importance of the area grew, and in a watershed moment in 1978, the owners of the 16,000-hectare Mungo holding sold their property to the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service. In the following year, Mungo National Park was created, and over the next 2 decades, more rural landholdings were added to form an area of 111,000 hectares within the World Heritage-listed Willandra Lakes region. When the European pastoralists arrived in the Willandra and Mungo Lakes region, 3 Aboriginal tribes inhabited the area, but they did not survive intact for long. With their homeland seized and their health compromised through contact with European diseases, many were moved on to a mission at Balranald, though some were retained as stockmen on the farms. This meant that while Aboriginal people had occupied the Mungo Lake area for thousands of years, in 1967, when, as a young geologist, Jim Bowler from the Australian National University began studying the ancient layers of sediment that formed the Mungo Lunette, there were, sadly, few Aboriginals left in the entire region. Having found what looked like stone tools in the ancient sediments, Bowler returned a year later and found what looked like burnt bones. He returned again the following year with 2 ANU archaeologists, John Mulvaney and Rhys Jones, and together they unearthed what was clearly human bones, which, when found to be female, became known as Mungo Lady. 5 years later, Bowler discovered a second set of bones, which were named Mungo Man. After initial uncertainty, the remains of Mungo Lady and Mungo Man were dated to be some 40,000 years old, making them the oldest documented human remains in Australia and among some of the oldest remains of modern man in the world. While a century of dubious pastoral practices obviously contributed to the erosion and exposure of this trove of archaeological treasures, the erosion probably commenced before European settlement, and despite the protected status of the entire region now, it is likely to continue and thus likely to expose more relics from the ancient depths of the Lunette. In addition to Mungo Lady and Mungo Man, over the following decade, an additional 106 sets of human remains were removed from the region. While the remains provided valuable scientific and anthropological insights, their removal had been carried out without permission from any of the local Aboriginal tribal elders, and, over the following years, calls for return of the remains were voiced. Those of Mungo Lady were returned in 1992, and those of Mungo Man were returned in 2017, although they were not reinterred. While generally supported in theory, practical aspects of the idea of reinterment became the subject of immense debate and caused division among the three traditional Aboriginal tribes, some of whom believed that the remains should not be reburied. However, in May 2022, the remains of Mungo Man and Mungo Lady were removed from a secure facility by a group of Aboriginal elders and, along with the 106 other sets of remains, were buried in an unknown location somewhere within the Willandra Lakes World Heritage Area. And so the great Mungo mystery is no longer who were Mungo Lady and Mungo Man, but where are they now? I drove a total of 1,690 kilometres to and from Mungo National Park and within the park for a total petrol cost of $262. My trip home was blighted by a massive fog which lasted for 6 hours, the first 2 of which were particularly stressful given the initial 150 kilometres of dirt and narrow tar roads. I'm just talking to myself here to keep my courage up. It's 4:30 on Friday. I don't know, maybe it's Friday the 13th, I don't know. Yes, it's Friday the 13th. I left Mungo about 20 minutes ago. I've got 150 kilometres. That was agreed. I've got 150 kilometres to go. The first 50 is dirt road and there is a very thick fog. If there wasn't fog to start with, I possibly wouldn't have even left if I had have known there was going to be this thick fog, but a few kilometres in and I was committed to it. I'm cruising along at between 60 and 70k, and once I'm out of the dirt I think it'll be easier. I might even get out of the fog in a little while. Otherwise I'll get to Balranald and I'll need fuel there. The only thing that's keeping me going are the markers on the side of the road, the red and white, red on the left, right on the white, the markers on the sides of the road keeping me going. My accommodation at the Mungo Lodge bunkhouse was $175 per night for 2 nights. However, after the first night, management of the lodge agreed to my request to be upgraded to a cabin at no extra cost because of problems I'd experienced with a lack of hot water in the showers of the communal bathrooms and the fact that the handle to the door of my bunk room was broken and didn't lock. A cabin usually costs $299 per night. A glamping tent costs $199, and an unpowered camping site is $29 per night. I mostly ate food that I brought with me, but I did have dinner at the lodge restaurant on the second night at a cost of $39, plus I had a coffee at a cost of $4.50. A continental breakfast was provided, although I left too early on the second morning to eat it. I stopped at Robertson's Hot Bread Bakery in Hay twice, once each way, and spent $12.14 on a large coffee and the best ever chocolate lamington with cream. A ticket for the guided tour of the Mungo Lunette is $50 per person, although I paid the seniors concession price of $35. In my next episode, I take on my 24th challenge in this series and venture into the world of welding and metalwork to make a rather large but wonderfully unique fire pit. For more information about living your own unlived life, if you go to my website, you can download a copy of my free book, Living Your Unlived Life, Finding Contentment by Honouring Your Dreams. And if it's your thing, you could like this video and subscribe to my channel.